So tonight we're doing the first half of the Gospel of Luke, and we read through chapter 12 just to split Luke in half to make the reading easier. But we'll probably tonight talk through about chapter 9, because after chapter 9 is where we have a turn in structure. And so just so we can hold that structure together, that's where we will probably get through. But even if you read all the way to 12, that's perfect, because next week we're finishing up the Gospel of Luke. And so it was good to read however far you got. But I want to start tonight with some context. And so just a video about the Roman Empire and maybe what some people might have experienced underneath that, and some of what's going on in the culture or will be going on after Jesus's time and during and a little leading up to his birth. So I'm going to share my screen so we can watch this video. And there we go. This will kind of set the scene for us.
The Great Revolt against the Romans that broke out in Judea in 66 CE can seem like an act of insanity. What were the Judeans thinking? That a handful of freedom fighters could defeat the Roman Empire? The brutal war machine that had conquered the whole world? It seems totally senseless, even bizarre. Let's go back 2,000 years to Judea under the Roman governors. For about 70 years, the Jews enjoyed relative freedom under a ruler from among their own people. Then, one fine morning, the Judeans awoke to a new reality. A harsh Roman governor controlled their land and property. This happened in the year 6 CE, when the Emperor Augustus decided to replace the Jewish government with a direct, tough Roman government that would fill his coffers. Even before the Roman governor reaches his magnificent palace in Caesarea, his officials set out to conduct a census. The officials go from house to house, registering every person and his possessions. No Jew will evade the oppressive tax, not even the poorest farmer. Imagine the little boy watching through the window as Roman soldiers beat his father just because he couldn't pay the heavy tax. This is painful and humiliating, but much worse things happen too. In this burial cave in northern Jerusalem, chilling evidence was discovered of one of the horrific punishments the Romans used to punish those who opposed their rule: crucifixion. The victim's feet were nailed to one wooden beam and his hands tied to another. He was left to suffer on the cross for hours in the hot sun until he died. And so that everyone would get the message, this was done in a central location. This was the main street of Jerusalem about 2,000 years ago. Here, by the roadside, archaeologists discovered a strange, enigmatic stepped stone structure, unlike any found before. People may have been crucified alive right here in the late Second Temple period. The mood in Jerusalem changes irreversibly. Armed Roman soldiers walk the streets, mocking the Jews and their religion. At night, one can hear their wild roars from violent entertainment. But the most humiliating thing is the Roman interference with the temple service. According to the new regime's laws, the Gentile governor now appoints the high priests. Alongside the daily sacrifice to the God of Israel, a daily sacrifice is now offered for the well-being of the Roman emperor, a symbol of oppression and subjugation. The Jews are furious, but from the heights of the nearby Antonia fortress, they're carefully observed. At the smallest sign of defiance, the Roman soldiers will confiscate the high priest's garments, putting an end to the holy temple service. What can be done in these circumstances? The high priests and the wealthy Jews know well what the Romans are capable of doing to rebels. They also believe that the Roman occupation is a divine decree not to be opposed. Here in Caesarea, perhaps even right here, where the ruins of a Byzantine-era synagogue stand, tension reached the boiling point. One Sabbath, several residents of Caesarea offered a pagan sacrifice at the entrance to the synagogue, and all hell broke loose. The provocation was accompanied by beatings and curses, and following the ensuing altercation, the Jews of the city left their homes and possessions behind, took the Torah scrolls, and fled the city. The Romans close in on the Jews from all sides, and with the appointment of new governors, the situation only grows worse. The new governors, even more corrupt and greedy than their predecessors, see their appointment as a chance to get rich quick at the citizens' expense. They stop at nothing to extort the last pennies from the people of Judea. The lives of the Jews under the Roman governors eventually become intolerable, truly hellish. And in such situations, it's hard to react reasonably. The voices of those who can no longer remain silent grow louder. Messiahs and prophets roam Jerusalem, declaring that the end of days has come and that the evil Roman Empire will fall in a great tumult. In the Galilee, a group of freedom fighters forms under Judah the Galilean. They swear they'll never serve mortal masters, only God above. Some of them join radical underground groups, such as the Sicarii. These attack the Romans, but also rob and murder their rich established brethren, whom they suspect to be collaborating with the enemy. And sometimes I wonder how I'd react if I were there. Would I accept the humiliation in silence and let the Romans treat me like dirt? Or would I fight for my life and dignity, knowing I was endangering myself, my family, and perhaps the whole Jewish people? And how about you? What would you do?
I wanted us to open with that clip to kind of set the stage of where we're going in history and what's going to be happening and the tensions that are building. Sometimes when we read the Gospels, we are reading them, well, almost always when we read them from relative safety and from a place of comfort. And but that's not where the Gospels are being spoken into or where they're being written from. And so a reminder of that where it's going with Roman occupation and what's building. Any thoughts you have from that clip? And or would you like to share what you would do? The speaker left us with a question at the end of that.
I'd work with the underground.
You would go in with the underground and
fight the big guys.
I don't know. Well, I missed the video, but I'm a lover and not a fighter, so I don't know.
You'd be a fighter.
Well, I'm a fighter. Okay. I'll go with Louise.
Well, and there was convincing each other what to do. And that was part of, as Jesus was speaking to people, people were already dividing up into how they're going to be responding and how they are responding to the changing atmosphere around them. And there were people who thought, violence is the only answer in this. We've tried everything else and they're taking too much. We just got to go all the way. And so that's some of Jesus' nonviolent message. Isn't just about being nonviolent. It's also directed at some of what's happening in that time and place too. It's very contextual with that. And so remembering those tensions that we are walking into as we start this gospel. And so we have the Gospel of Luke. Luke, like Matthew, takes content from Mark. They both have quite a bit of content that they have in both. And I've got a chart here I'll show you that breaks it up into percentages of where the content is. So you can kind of see in Mark what's unique to Mark. It's that little brown 3% of the pie chart on Mark is only in the Gospel of Mark. The purple part on the pie chart for Mark, 76%, is in all three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, in all of those. And then we have some content, 18% in Mark, that's also in Matthew. And that content, Matthew and Luke are longer than Mark. So that content takes up about 10% of Matthew. And then we have a small percentage that's both in Mark and Luke, but not in Matthew. And we can see that that's 3% of Mark is in Luke, but not Matthew, and 1% of Luke is just content from Mark. We also have Luke, as opposed to Matthew, has 35% that's unique to Luke. And Matthew has a slightly smaller amount that's unique to Luke. There's also this other source that's known as Q. We have no idea what the source is. We just use Q. It just means source. And that is in both Luke and Matthew. It's shared content between those two, and it's not in Mark. So it's thought that that comes from some other tradition or some other source that might be shared. Although some scholars say there is no Q. They have shared content, but there's no single other source that they're pulling from. And so not all scholars are agree with that there is a single Q source. So this is the makeup of those. As far as Luke goes, Luke has that fair amount of content that's in Luke only, and part of that is in the first part of the middle section of Luke is kind of Luke only. And I was going to give you some, got it written down here just a second. So Luke material, the gospel, the nativity story is only in Matthew and Luke. Mark doesn't tell the story of Christ's birth, and John doesn't tell the story of Christ's birth. And there's different content in Luke and in Matthew. So parts of that nativity are only in Luke. Luke is the gospel that has the story of the shepherds. Matthew is the gospel that has the story of the Magi. And keep that in mind, because we're going to see if we can figure out why that might be as we go through tonight's class. Why is it that Luke might focus more on shepherds, whereas Matthew focuses on these Magi or these kings from another place? The end of the gospel in Luke is different than the other gospels. And the middle chapters 9 through 19 are lots of that is unique to Luke, although there's also some shared content with Matthew in that middle section of Luke. Some of the parables are Luke parables. The famous one, the Good Samaritan, that's a Luke parable. The rich man, Lazarus, those stories in chapter 16, that's a Luke parable. The prodigal son is a Luke parable. And so we have there's also the manager with the debtors, that's a Luke parable as well. And so that's unique content for the Gospel of Luke.
Mm-hmm.
Anything you noticed as you read through this first half of Luke?
The first half of Luke, that would be through 12.
Through 12, yep. Today we're focused more on through 9, but talk through 12 today, right now.
Okay. Well, in the middle of my Bible, there's a graph, the parables of Jesus, and it matches Matthew, Mark, and Luke, or it indicates where these particular parables can be found. And 15 of them, at least 15 of them, are Luke exclusive, which surpasses the number that are unique only to Matthew. There aren't very many actually in Mark, but it's the shortest book, and there wouldn't be quite as many in there. That really grabbed my attention. And I was looking at the people that Jesus was talking to or dealing with through not just the first half of the gospel, but the whole gospel. And it seems like Matthew was talking to the Jewish folks, and Jesus kind of had a mixed bag all the way through it. He was addressing and doing a lot of stuff for Gentiles, for non-Jewish people, as well as for that particular sect as well. It was pretty clear that the intent of Luke was to reach people who were not necessarily of the Jewish heritage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Luke definitely has a different audience. John said too, Luke is easier to read, and that's part of Luke even spells it out in the beginning. If we look at chapter 1, starting verse 1, since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, I too decided, after investigating everything carefully from the very first, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus and Philippus. And this writing down an orderly account, like that's Luke's goal, that this is easier to read and that it's in order and it's more logical, like there's a logical flow to everything throughout this gospel. And so it is easier for us to read, and it's purposefully written, so it would be. It's written to, it says, to most excellent Theophilus, and that means, so that may be a person, but that word also means lover of God or friend of God. So it may also be that it's being written to those who find themselves to be lovers of God or friends of God. And it might not be a person. If it is a person, it's probably somebody of higher social status because of the title most excellent. But Luke's gospel speaks a lot to those who are impoverished and downtrodden. And so it could be argued that why would Luke be writing it for somebody of high status, but that maybe Luke is actually calling those who are of just regular status or low status most excellent, and is even in the introduction uplifting the downtrodden.
You know when this was written?
So none of the gospels are written by eyewitnesses, and so this would have been, most of them are placed kind of around like the 66 era-ish for the gospels.
Okay.
Somewhere around there.
Yeah.
Although Luke's later, I'm sorry, Luke is probably later, probably about 20 years later, probably around like 85. I had the 66 in mind from the video we just watched. Closer to 85 Common Era. And it could be a little, maybe 10 to 15 years on either side off from that.
I was wondering because part of my prologue says Luke was not an eyewitness of the events in his gospel, but he relied on the testimony of apostolic eyewitnesses and reliable written sources. So I'm thinking he had to have had some contact with the apostles themselves. I'm sorry, I got a little bit of a frog.
Yeah, maybe. As John said, he appears to have done his research. And he does. So the writer of Luke does say, as they were these stories that were handed on to us by those who from the very beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. So either from that we can take either Luke spoke to the eyewitnesses, or he's he's heard the stories that the eyewitnesses told. Maybe another thing that he's saying.
Okay. And they probably would have been addressing fairly large crowds as well during their teaching ministries.
Yeah, well, they wanted to spread it as far as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And it would have been, because there's so much shared content, there must have been stories that were being passed on with good accuracy. And that's something that sometimes we forget about, is the accuracy of storytelling and the accuracy of oral tradition. I know we talked about this when we talked, we're in the Hebrew Bible too, is today we tell jokes about, like, somebody goes fishing and like they talk about the fish they caught and it was this big, and the next time it's this big, and the next time it's this big, and like, and the next time it's not even on the screen. Like, things keep changing. But but when storytelling is your main means of passing information on, you would have people who are trained storytellers and people for whom accuracy is very important, and that it is possible that if it's not a game of telephone in storytelling and oral traditions, it has a much higher accuracy than people who are not trained in that at all and would be playing telephone with each other.
Right. Okay.
So John asked, why don't any of the books write about the destruction of Jerusalem? Are you talking about, John, the destruction of Jerusalem in the Babylonian era, or the destruction of Jerusalem that will be occurring after Jesus's crucifixion and resurrection? So yeah, around 70. So they do and they don't. So they do in that they allude to it when Jesus says things like, you see all these bricks on top of each other, every single one of them will be coming down. And so that is a way that they are talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, but because they're telling the story of Jesus and they're trying to tell it as if they're not looking back on telling it, but giving a report of that time, they're not talking directly about the destruction of Jerusalem because that occurred after the resurrection. But they do, and that's how people, the references to the destruction of Jerusalem with the rocks coming down or any allusions to it is actually how they date these gospels. And one of the reasons why the Gospel of Luke, they think, would be written after that period, because there are allusions to the destruction of the temple. Then we get further into the Gospel of Luke, and we start with this well-known story. Luke has the most content as far as the infancy narrative. We get the story of Elizabeth, we get the story of John the Baptist's birth, we get the story of Zacchaeus not being able to speak and suddenly able to speak, and we get references back to the Old Testament throughout here, even if they're not sometimes explicit references, sometimes not, just allusions back to it. And so this is definitely, when we tell the Christmas story, a lot of the content we take from Luke. And usually when we tell the Christmas story, we also take content from Matthew and we mix them all together, which is why in our nativity sets we have the shepherds that come and we've got wise men that come. Like, they all come and do this. And we have these stories of this manger. And we don't have a story of a manger in Matthew, we just got it in Luke, but we put it all together. So it can be hard to separate that out from one another, to really look at. But one of the things that when you read Luke in isolation, Luke seems to uplift in this infancy narrative, uplifting how impoverished they were. And that the Christ child is placed in a manger because there was no room in the inn. That it was this that Mary came to Mary, and Mary's like, who am I? Like, why would you come to me? And so really uplifting these stories. Also the shepherds in this region, there were shepherds living in the field, keeping watch over their flock at night. Shepherding was not a super well-paid profession like that. There were many shepherds. It was hard work. It was dangerous work, and it wasn't super well compensated. So you would have people who were closer in poverty in that. And we see that same theme carried throughout Luke. Again and again, Luke is uplifting those who are impoverished and those who are on the outskirts and pulling them in. Luke is also the most friendly to women too. This is the gospel that uplifts women more than any of the other gospels. And women at this time are being pushed to the outskirts. They're on the edge of society. They don't have the same rights. And so Luke is uplifting them and names more women than the other gospels do too. Not just that these women exist and they're served, but they have names, which is important. And so they have identities as well. And they're a part of the ending. The women don't even see Jesus, but they believe and share it. The disciples see Jesus and they don't even believe it. and that's in Luke where that story is told. And it's important that it's told that way because it is the population that is more that is left to their own means or lower on the social status that is being turned upside down and uplifted. And Luke does that throughout the gospel. And so it's a little bit on Luke here. One thing that I think sometimes people find interesting, Gabriel's mentioned in the Gospel of Luke. Gabriel's the angel who comes and visits, and Gabriel means God is my hero. And there's only 2 angels that are mentioned in the Protestant Bible. So we have Gabriel and we have Michael. Those are the only 2. Gabriel's also named in Daniel, and Michael's named in Daniel as well, and in Revelation. So which I always find interesting because we have so much pop culture thanks to Dante's Inferno and movies around like heaven and hell and demons and angels and like just this whole multitude of names. But in the Protestant Bible, we only have 2 names, and they don't look like fat little babies with wings, probably. So I want to move us into the structure of Luke. So I've got another video for us, and this is from the Bible Project, and it'll go through Luke 1 through 9. And this is why I said we're going to talk more 1 through 9, because that's where the structure will break off. Share that video here.
The Gospel according to Luke, it's one of the earliest accounts of Jesus' life, and it's actually part one of a unified 2-volume work, Luke Acts. If you compare the opening lines of both of these books, it's clear that they come from the same author, and there are internal clues in the book of Acts, as well as an early tradition that identifies the author as Luke, the traveling companion and co-worker of Paul the Apostle, who we know was also a doctor. Luke opens his work with a preface telling us how and why he wrote this book. He acknowledges that there's many other fine accounts of Jesus' life out there, but he wanted to go back to the eyewitness traditions of as many early disciples as he could, in order to produce what he calls an orderly account about the things that have been fulfilled among us. Now that word fulfilled shows us why Luke wrote this account. For him, the story of Jesus isn't just ancient history. He wants to show how it's the fulfillment of the long covenant story of God and Israel, and bigger than that, of the story of God in the whole world. The book's design is fairly clear. There's a long introduction that sets up the stories of John the Baptist and Jesus. Then in chapters 3 to 9, Luke presents a robust portrait of Jesus and his mission in his home region of Galilee. After that, the large midsection of the book is Jesus' long journey to Jerusalem, which leads to the story's climax, Jesus' final week in Jerusalem leading up to his death and resurrection, which then leads on into the book of Acts. In this video, we're just going to focus on the first half of Luke's gospel. The extended introduction tells in parallel the birth stories of John the Baptist and Jesus. So you have this elderly priestly couple, Zechariah and Elizabeth, and then this young unmarried woman, Mary and Joseph. They both receive an unlikely divine promise that they're going to have a son. Both promises are fulfilled then, as John and then Jesus are born, and both parents sing poems of celebration. Now these poetic songs, they're filled with echoes from the Old Testament, Psalms and prophets, showing how these children will fulfill God's ancient promises. But these poems also preview each child's role in the story to follow. So John is the prophetic messenger promised in the Torah and the prophets who's going to prepare Israel to meet their God. And Jesus, he's the messianic king promised to David, who's going to bring God's reign over Israel and God's blessing to the nations, just like he promised to Abraham. After this, Mary brings Jesus to the Jerusalem temple for his dedication, and 2 elderly prophets, Anna and Simeon, they see Jesus and they recognize who he is. And Simeon sings his own song, a poem inspired by the prophet Isaiah. He says, "This child is God's salvation for Israel, and he will become a light to the nations." So with all this anticipation, the story moves forward into the next main section, where Luke presents Jesus and his mission. He sets the stage with John's renewal movement at the Jordan River, where he's calling a new, repentant, recommitted Israel into existence through baptism. He's preparing for the arrival of God's kingdom. And then Jesus appears as the leader of this new Israel, and he's marked out by the Spirit and the voice of God from heaven. He is the beloved Son of God. After this, Luke follows with the genealogy, and it traces Jesus' origins back to David, then back to Abraham, and then all the way back to Adam from the book of Genesis. Luke's claiming here that Jesus is the messianic king of Israel who will bring God's blessing, but not only to Israel, the family of Abraham. He is here for all the sons of Adam, for all humanity. After this, Luke has strategically placed the story of Jesus going to his hometown Nazareth, where he launches his public mission. At a synagogue gathering, Jesus stands up and he reads from the scroll of Isaiah, saying, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, to preach good news to the poor and freedom for the prisoners, new sight for the blind and freedom for the oppressed." Now, along with the other Gospels, Jesus is presented here, he's the Messianic King bringing the good news of God's kingdom. But what Luke uniquely highlights are the social implications of Jesus' mission. So he brings freedom. The Greek word is aphesis. It literally means release, and it refers to the ancient Jewish practice of the year of Jubilee described in Leviticus 25. It's when all Israelite slaves were released, when people's debts were canceled, when land that was sold is returned back to families. It's all a symbolic reenactment of God's liberating justice and mercy. And then Jesus says that this good news of release is specifically for the poor. Now, in the Old Testament, the poor, or in Hebrew, ani, it's a much broader category than just people who don't have very much money. It refers also to people of low social status in their culture, like people with disabilities or women and children and the elderly. It also can include social outsiders, like people of other ethnic groups, or people whose poor life choices have placed them outside acceptable religious circles. And Jesus says that God's kingdom is especially good news for these people. So after this, Luke immediately puts in front of us a large block of stories, showing us what Jesus' good news for the poor looks like. It involves the healing of a bedridden sick woman, or a man who has a skin disease, or someone who's paralyzed. There are stories here also about Jesus welcoming into his community a tax collector like Levi, who's not financially poor, but he is a social outsider. There's a story about Jesus forgiving a prostitute. Luke's showing us how Jesus' kingdom brought restoration and reversal of people's whole life circumstances. He's expanding the circle of people who get invited in to discover the healing power of God's kingdom. And as Jesus' mission attracts a large following, he does something even more provocative. He forms these people into a new Israel by appointing over them the 12 disciples as leaders corresponding to the 12 tribes of Israel. And then Jesus teaches his manifesto of an upside-down kingdom, or as Luke calls it, the sermon given on the plain. He says God's love for the outsider and the poor means that his kingdom brings a reversal of all of our value systems. He is here to form a new alternative people of God who are going to respond to Jesus' invitation by practicing radical generosity, by serving the poor. People who are going to lead by serving and live by peacemaking and forgiveness. People who are deeply pious but who reject religious hypocrisy. Now, Jesus' radical kingdom vision, his claim to divine authority, it starts to generate resistance and controversy, especially from Israel's religious leaders. His outreach to questionable people, it's a threat to their religious traditions and their sense of social stability. And so they start accusing Jesus of blaspheming God, of being a drunk and mixing with sinners. And so this section culminates in a new revelation of Jesus' mission to his disciples. He says that yes, he is the Messianic king, and that he's going to assert his reign over Israel by dying in Jerusalem, by becoming the suffering servant king of Isaiah 53, who dies for the sins of Israel. And then this shocking idea, it gets explored in the next story, as Jesus goes up a mountain with 3 of his disciples, and he's suddenly transformed in front of them. They're enveloped in this cloud of God's presence, who announces, "This is my chosen son." And then Moses and Elijah are there, the 2 other prophets who encountered God's presence and voice on a mountain. And Luke tells us that they're talking together about Jesus' exodus that he was about to fulfill in Jerusalem. Now that Greek word exodus, it's a clear reference to the Exodus story. Luke is portraying Jesus here as a new Moses who will lead his newly formed Israel into freedom and release from the tyranny of sin and evil in all of its forms, personal, spiritual, and social. And that's going to lead us into the second half of the book. But for now, that's the first half of the Gospel according to Luke.
Any thoughts from that one?
That's a pretty good synopsis of Jesus' life from birth to the transfiguration. It was really very, very good as far as the progression of the different highlights in Jesus' life. When they were brought to the temple, they did that according to Jewish tradition, and that was really important. And then going forward and mentioning, like you said, women were mentioned more frequently in Luke. And I thought it was interesting that, yes, Anna was mentioned right along with Simeon when he was baptized in the temple. And I thought that was neat, really neat. And I think Luke is the only one that's got the Magnificat and the Benedictus, which are beautiful pieces of poetry, just beautiful pieces of poetry. And I thought that they did a really good job. I thought the writer did a very good job of that.
Yeah, the Bible Project always does great work. I think summarizing and also showing us some of the structure.
Mhm,
That can be a
mhm.
hard thing to sometimes imagine, is how is this all coming together? Especially because when we're in church, we just read sections and we're not reading it all as one big body
Right.
with each other. And so we miss some of those nuances of the Gospels
Mhm,
when we do that.
mhm.
One piece in your reading tonight that I wanted to point out is one of the most famous scriptures from the Gospel are the Beatitudes that we
Oh,
hear read
yes.
different places. And so I want to point out the difference between Matthew's Beatitude and Luke's Beatitude. So Matthew's Beatitudes are in Matthew chapter 5. And so we have in Matthew chapter 5, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Then it goes into, you are the salt of the earth, light of the world, scriptures. This is the Beatitudes so that was from Matthew. This is from the Gospel of Luke. Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you will be filled. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. Blessed are you when people hate you and when they exclude you, revile you, and defame you on account of the Son of Man. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy, for surely your reward is great in heaven, for that is what their ancestors did to the prophets. But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe to you who are full now, for you will be hungry. Woe to you who are laughing now, for you will mourn and weep. Woe to you when all speak well of you, for this is what their ancestors did to the false prophets. But I say to you that listen, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, and so on. What did you hear different between the Beatitudes from Matthew and the Beatitudes written in Luke? Anything pop out?
Well, can you tell me where in Matthew the Beatitudes are?
Yeah, they're in Matthew chapter 5, and then in Luke, Luke chapter.
Are you talking the whole chapter 5?
It starts at chapter 5, verse 3 is where it starts and goes through 12.
Okay, because I was trying to follow you and I couldn't.
So it's Matthew chapter 5, verse 3.
Well, I don't know, maybe I'm all wrong on this, but I thought there was a lot of comparison with the teachings in the Luke as well as what you just read to us.
There's a lot of similarities. There's definitely content that's shared between these gospels, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But were there any differences you noticed?
What's the first Beatitude in Luke?
So the first one in Luke is, blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of heaven.
Okay, in Matthew is, blessed are the poor in spirit.
Right. That's a big I think that's a big difference. You who are poor versus you who are poor in spirit.
Yep.
That's a
and what is the second one? What is the second one in Luke?
In Luke, blessed are you who are hungry now, for you will be filled.
And then what's the difference of the Luke one then? Is that the one with Luke? You are hungry now?
Probably the closest for that one, Camille, would be verse 6.
Oh, okay.
For righteousness.
Yeah, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. And then we get in Luke,
Big difference.
blessed, yeah, big difference. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. Probably closest for that one would be 4 in Matthew.
For they will be comforted.
Yep, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. I think there's a bit of a difference in that one. It's more similar than some of the other ones. And then 22, that one's kind of similar, but how about this one? But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation.
We don't have woes to.
There's not, we don't even have that in Matthew. Woe to
No,
you who are full now, for you will be hungry. Woe to you who are laughing now, for you will mourn and weep. Woe to you when all speak well of you,
Yeah.
for that is what their
Yeah.
ancestors did to the false prophets. We don't have any of that in Matthew. So why might that be? Why might we have these? I mean, there's major differences between blessed are you are poor versus blessed are you are the poor in spirit.
Spirit.
Blessed are you who are hungry now versus blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness.
For righteousness, yes.
And no woes to the rich, the full, or the laughing, or the.
About the only thing that I can is verse 20 of chapter 5 in Matthew. For I say to you that unless your righteousness is more than that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. But that's about it.
Yeah. So one of the things that's different about Luke than from Matthew is, as was mentioned in the Bible Project too, is the social implications are important. And so are the political implications, the cultural community implications, the actual physical implications are more important in Luke, whereas Matthew is focused a little more on the spiritual side of things and doesn't really address as directly, what if you're just hungry? What if you're actually impoverished? What if your basic needs are not being met? John, you said that more are hopeful for the poor and the destitute. Which one do you think is more hopeful? The reversal of the current status. Do you think from Matthew or Luke it would be more hopeful for the poor and destitute?
I would think it would
Oh, for
be
22 20 to 23.
in what chapter?
Probably in Luke, I'm guessing, because that's the other ones are you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. So I'm guessing John means in Luke, those chapters. The blessed are more hopeful than the woe to you who are rich. And the other part of Luke, we're also seeing a bit in the Beatitudes who Luke is talking to. Although Luke really speaks a lot about those who are poor and those even physically are not getting enough food to eat. Those who are full of grief because of what is happening in their very lives because of the status of the world. And very much what's actually occurring, what's not just what's happening spiritually, but also what's happening physically to people. But Luke talks a lot about that, but his audience is not just people who are on the outskirts. Luke is also writing to the rich, to the people who are full, to the people who are laughing now, to the people who have high social status and all talk well of. And Luke is speaking not directly, because Luke doesn't do direct confrontation, although that's pretty direct. But he does it kind of in an indirect way, and is telling people, you have to change. Like, you have to change what you're doing. And that's why we get the story of the rich man in the Gospel of Luke too. We get stories of people who are poor coming to receive assistance from Christ and transformation. We also get stories of people who have everything coming and needing to be transformed. Because in order for the social situation, to be turned upside down and for there to be a great reversal, the rich also have to stop being rich. In order to uplift the poor and have it be equal, some have to give up and some then can give up. And so that's the gospel of, and we see that in some other places in the Gospel of Luke too. But the Beatitudes, I think, are a place where we can see it because we know it so well. Really feel that. For any other last thoughts, Luke, the spiritual and holistic piece of Luke is important, but so is the material, political and social dimensions of Luke as well.
Well, I think there were a lot of places here where he may not have been taking direct aim at the Pharisees and the scribes, the higher echelon, but they definitely got the message very, very strongly. He was at the house of a Pharisee. He was having dinner, and a sinful woman came in and was washing his feet with her tears and wiping him with her hair, and anointing his feet with perfume. And he definitely made a specific, direct reference to, you didn't offer me water to have my feet washed, which was the custom when you were invited to somebody's house. Everybody wore sandals. Everybody's feet got dirty. And this was just one of the polite things that you did for guests when they came to dinner. And he was not offered that. He was not offered ointment for smelling a little bit better at dinner, things of that nature. That was a direct thing. And then to tell her that her sins were forgiven. I mean, there couldn't have been a more blasphemous statement he could have made the echelon of the Jewish hierarchy. My gosh, who do you think you are? And he's made that point a couple of times. Is it easier to say your sins are forgiven or get up and walk? And they were constantly confronted by him, working on the Sabbath, eating on the Sabbath, for those grains that the apostles were getting through the field. I think that it wasn't so subtle. I think those lessons to them were right between the eyes. Right between the eyes.
Yeah. What's maybe a little more maybe a little more Midwestern than New York style. Maybe that's the difference.
Okay, maybe not right between the eyes, but definitely a slap on the wrist.
That's right. Yeah. It uses some parables, and there's some maybe more passive aggressive way of doing it. That's
right.
Even more like more memorable and hits the point even more so. And it would have been directed in a different way.
Yeah.
The other thing about bringing up sin too is that we never find out what people's sins are. It says their sins were forgiven or they were sinners. That doesn't say this is how they sinned. Here's their list of sins. But it doesn't actually matter. in the Gospels what those sins were. And what matters is they're wiped off. They're clean.
Well, there's a couple places where they were specified. Oh yeah, think of it now. Oh, when a tax collector said, "Oh, gosh, I know I'm really deep in the soup. What do I need to do?" And the answer was, don't collect any more taxes than is owed,
Mhm.
which are, which was really important because they were big skimmers. And the soldier who said, well, what can I do? Well, they were notorious for collecting more than they were offered as well. And they were told, be happy with your pay. Just be happy with your pay. So they were given some concrete examples of what they could do. And I thought one of the really good lessons, I've always liked this one, Zacchaeus, the short little guy that wanted to see Jesus. He's got a huge following behind him. So he runs ahead and climbs the tree. And Jesus stops and says, "Come on down, I'm having dinner at your house." And you see the repentance, the true repentance that he demonstrated after that. And I think that brings forth with, it doesn't matter how far down you get, Jesus is the answer. Love is the answer. Respect for your fellow man is the answer. Got a lot out of that. I did. And I must have read that story hundreds of times. It just never fails to amaze me.
Yeah. And
I'm sorry. Am I getting off course here?
in those stories of the tax collector and the soldier, that's conversations with John the Baptist, not even with Jesus.
Oh,
And so
that's
that's
true.
when they Jesus
Yeah,
is
that's
out.
true.
That's with the brood of vipers story. When John is out baptizing, and they ask John, well, what can I do? And that's where John responds to them, to the crowds on that. And there's a little different understanding between what's coming next between John and what Jesus fulfills too. And so we have a bit of a change from that as well. But there's some good news, I think, in that story in Luke with John the Baptist, that it doesn't matter who comes forward. There's always something everyone can do, like that can do. No one has ever done so much. There's not some way that we can make amends in some way, something. Well, we'll read for next week. We'll finish the Gospel of Luke, and so we'll get to read through the end of it and hear how the story, how Luke tells us the end of the story, which will be more fulfilling than Mark's ending, for sure. It's much more spelled out.
Oh, for some reason, I thought we were to read the entire thing of Luke for this week.
Well, that's okay. And you're ahead.
Well, I enjoyed it.
Yeah, I did too. This is very interesting. I love it. Going back and forth. I'm catching you a little here and there, and I find it very interesting. I do. I guess I've been reading more into where he's doing more of the healing and the preaching, and this is where I like healed the man with this harm and healed the woman with the fever, and those are the things I was getting into. I guess I get to know all the social. Well, I read about the tax person too. Yeah, right. Anyway, well, it was interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah. So we'll finish up. We'll go further in Luke next week, and so we'll bring more thoughts too, and then we'll take a break. We're going to take a Christmas break, and then we'll pick up with John in the new year.
Oh. We better spend a little time on John.
So we'll do John starting January 12th is when we'll do John. So we'll have a 3-week break in between.
Mhm.
But,
Yeah,
yeah.
okay.
And
Okay.
one other thing about Luke that we'll get into more next time is Luke and Acts are connected with one another. And so as you're
Mhm.
reading, even as you read the end of Luke, it's not actually the end of Luke because Acts is connected with Luke.
Right, right. Yeah. Thanks so much, Gretchen.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thank
thank
you,
you, Gretchen.
everybody.
Thank you. Have a great week.